As we continue with our lecture, I would now like to discuss some of the similarities between Salafi-jihadism and white supremacy extremism. I spent years tracking, analyzing, and ultimately trying to disrupt terrorist organizations. And I see many similarities today between the rise of global Salafi jihadist ideology in the 80s and 90s and the white supremacist ideology in recent years. While we have continued to focus on the very real threat to the homeland posed by jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State, we have overlooked the threat to the homeland from within, from white supremacist organizations and other violent actors. Worse still, the US government is at a disadvantage, largely due to the lack of comprehensive legislation and available tools for dealing with domestic terrorism. I also worry that we do not always have the same political will to respond to this form of violence in the same way we pursue other ideological threats, even though violence is violence and terrorism is terrorism. But there are still important lessons from studying the fight against Al-Qaeda and the so-called Islamic State I believe we can apply today. As previously discussed, domestic terrorism in the United States today is a more serious threat than it has ever been. Today, the threat is complex and far from a monolith. To include racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, neo-Nazis, white supremacist groups, anti-government militias, and conspiracy theorists, among other violent actors. There also exists a serious potential of a cross-pollination between these entities resulting in a force multiplier effects. And as we focus today on white supremacy extremism, I have also touched upon the misleading characterization that this threat is strictly a national issue. This is not the case. And one of the most dangerous aspects of this threat is the transnational dimension. The attacks in Norway in 2011 and Christchurch in New Zealand in 2019 show this very clearly. Both Andre Breivik and Brenton Tarrant drew inspiration from grievances from other countries and causes, while each presented himself as a defender of global European white civilization. So let us look at these similarities between the white supremacists and the jihadists. Like the jihadists, white supremacist extremists justify the use of terrorism and violence. Both groups often deploy metaphors in their writings and propaganda that reflects a firm belief that their societies are under siege and that only violence can hold the invaders. One group believes in racial purity. The other believes in religious purity. Violence is viewed by both groups as something that is both utilitarian, but at times theatrical, intended to inspire followers while terrorizing others. Both groups have been active online and on social media, radicalizing and recruiting vulnerable populations in the online space. Among far-right extremists in the US today, there are countless radicals who play a similar role to jihadi propagandists, preaching violence and hate to their followers behind the shield of constitutional protections. In some ways, the US serves as an epicenter of white supremacist ideologues, and any attempt to silence them will face legal challenges even more complex than the struggle to stop Al-Qaeda recruiters. Further, we have seen the global white supremacy extremist network embedded itself in conflict in a similar way done by jihadist groups. The conflict in eastern Ukraine have emerged as a hub in the broader network of transnational white supremacy extremism, attracting foreign recruits from all over the Western world. Where jihadis once traveled to fight in places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, white supremacists now have their own theater in which to learn combat, specifically eastern Ukraine, where the conflict between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government forces have been ongoing since 2014, attracting fighters from around the globe. For neo-Nazis and white supremacists, Travel to Ukraine allowed them to develop military training skills and actual combat experience. They can also forge networks and relationships with other like-minded extremists. There are also striking similarities in the rhetoric and narratives both groups employ towards society, especially narratives around the gender and roles of women and children. For years, my team and I studied the rise and the fall of the so-called Islamic State. Our research showed that a cohort of over 40,000 foreigners flocked to join the Islamic State's caliphate while it possessed territory all the way from 110 different countries. Among them were thousands of women. An assessment and comparison of the narratives utilized by jihadist and white supremacy extremists shows many similarities between how both movements treat and depict women. Again, they are both obsessed with purity, whether it's purity of the religion or purity of the race. And both groups deploy narratives about women within this context. Both ideologies declare that in-group women are under attack from outsiders. Both groups lionize so-called traditional values and gender stereotypes. Another commonality is that too often our responses do not adequately work to understand how both men and women join these movements and what policies and programs can best support both men and women to move away from extremism. A truly concerning trend, and one that is increasingly reported by media and other researchers in this space, is the recruitment of young people to neo-Nazi and violent white supremacist movements. The Islamic State utilization of children, most infamously their cubs of the caliphate, is well documented. However, another alarming similarity is the recruitment of minors to the extreme right. For example, last year it was revealed that the Rhetoric division, an international neo-Nazi group predominantly active online, was led by a 13-year-old boy from Estonia. The leaders of Atomwaffen, a US-based neo-Nazi group, began posting on the Iron March forum as teens. These teens would soon become Atomwaffen's earliest members. White supremacist online spaces are flooded with cartoons, jokes, memes, and viral videos. This hateful content is bright, funny, casual, and these formats work to normalize extremism and violence within its increasingly young audiences. And we see this extremism in video games and in spaces like Discord. The targeting of children and minors by violent actors is incredibly overlooked and understudied. So again, further attention and resources are desperately needed to understand how both hateful ideologies are packaged for children globally. Our current counterterrorism framework was set up in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to deal almost exclusively with foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. However, as I have set out in this series of lectures, the terrorism landscape in America has evolved, and so too must our response. A recurring thread in our discussion today is that violence is violence and terrorism is terrorism. I hope this overview of the similarities between Salafi-jihadists and white supremacy extremists encourages all to take seriously all threats of violence and extremism as they exist today. Thank you again for your time.